There is a particular kind of silence that doesn't sound like peace. It doesn't arrive gently. It doesn't announce itself with meditation or calm breath. It arrives the way a power grid goes dark, suddenly, completely, without warning. One moment the light is on, and then it isn't. If you have ever watched an empath go silent, truly, fully silent, you already know this feeling. Something shifts in the air around them. The warmth that used to pour from them without effort just stops. Their replies become shorter. Their eyes stop searching yours with that old, desperate hopefulness. They stop asking how you are. They stop explaining themselves. They stop reaching. And to everyone around them, this silence looks like coldness. It looks like betrayal. But Carl Jung, who spent his entire life mapping the hidden machinery of the human soul, saw this silence for what it really was. And his warning about it is one of the most misunderstood passages in all of depth psychology. Because Jung didn't see the empath's silence as a breakdown, he saw it as an announcement. To understand what the silence means, you must first understand what came before it. The empath did not begin as someone who gives too much. They began as someone who felt too much, and discovered early that feeling too much in a world that doesn't know what to do with deep feeling is a kind of exposure, a vulnerability, a liability. So they developed a solution. They learned to turn their sensitivity outward, to feel what others feel so precisely that they could respond before the pain even reached the surface. They became the one who noticed the shift in your tone before you recognized it yourself. The one who stayed on the phone at midnight, not because you asked, but because they knew you needed it. The one who could walk into a room and within seconds identify who was hurting and quietly begin orbiting that person, offering warmth without anyone asking for it. Jung would have called this the construction of a persona. The persona, in Jungian terms, is the mask we wear for the world, the role we perform in order to belong, to be needed, to be safe. And for the empath, that persona was forged early, perhaps in a childhood home where love was conditional on being agreeable, perhaps in a household of chaos where someone had to be the stable one, perhaps simply in the repeated discovery that their sensitivity was only welcomed when it was directed outward, when it served others. So they built the mask, the healer, the listener, the one who never causes trouble, the one who always understands. And for a long time, the mask worked. People loved them for it, came to rely on them, orbited them the way cold things orbit a heat source. The empath poured and told themselves this was simply who they were, that this was their gift, their purpose, their calling. They never noticed the cost. Jung made a quiet and devastating observation about people who live behind their persona for too long. He said, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." In other words, the mask is not the self, it never was. And the longer you wear a mask, the more the true self begins to push back. This is what leads to the silence. It rarely comes from one dramatic event, though sometimes a single moment becomes the final straw. Mostly, it comes from accumulation. The empath has given their presence to someone who mistook it for inexhaustibility. They have listened to someone's pain, while their own pain collected quietly in rooms no one ever visited. They have said it's fine so many times that the words stopped meaning anything, even to themselves. They have been available at midnight, and then spent the day alone. They have given their most careful words to people who offered carelessness in return. They have held space for explosions and breakdowns and grief that was never theirs, and absorbed it all into a body that was never designed to be a container for so much borrowed pain. And then, very quietly, usually without fanfare, something in them stops. Not dramatically, not in a storm of confrontation or a flood of accusations. There are no ultimatums, no final speeches. The empath simply withdraws. They stop calling first. Stop texting back with that old immediacy. Stop volunteering their comfort. When you ask if something is wrong, they say, "Nothing is wrong." But something has shifted behind their eyes that you cannot name. The warmth is still technically present, but it no longer reaches you the same way. They have gone silent. Here is where most people misread what is happening. The people in the empath's life interpret the silence as punishment, as manipulation, as emotional withdrawal being used as a weapon. They used to be so warm, they say. Now they're cold. Something is wrong with them. They've changed. But Jung would have said, yes, something has changed, something necessary. Because beneath the persona of the healer, the listener, the one who always gives, Jung saw something that very few empaths are willing to acknowledge. He saw the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is not simply the dark side of a person. It is everything we have refused to integrate, everything we have disowned about ourselves in order to maintain the identity we present to the world. And for the empath, whose entire identity is built on selflessness, on sensitivity, on being the one who loves without limit, the shadow contains everything that contradicts that identity. It contains anger, real anger, the kind that builds slowly over years of being taken for granted, the kind that doesn't look righteous or noble, just raw and inconvenient and deeply embarrassing to someone who has built their entire self-concept on being the gentle one. It contains resentment, the quiet, accumulated ledger of every time they showed up and no one showed up for them. Every time they gave and received nothing of equivalent weight. Every midnight phone call that was never returned when it was their own midnight. And it contains, this is the part Jung considered most dangerous, a form of control. Because here is Jung's most misunderstood warning about the empath. Perpetual self-sacrifice is never truly selfless. He wrote about this in a way that disturbed many readers. He observed that people who give endlessly, who make their identity entirely out of service and care and availability, are often, unconsciously, engaged in a subtle form of power. By never having needs of their own, they make others feel permanently indebted. By always being the one who gives, they ensure that others are always in the position of receiving, and therefore always slightly dependent, always slightly in the wrong for not giving back enough. This is not a conscious manipulation. The empath does not sit down and plan this. But Jung argued that the unconscious is always present, always working, always seeking something. And what the empath's unconscious seeks, beneath all that beautiful selflessness, is to matter, to be irreplaceable, to ensure that love cannot be withdrawn, because how could anyone leave someone who gives so completely? The giving is real, but the reason for it is more complicated than it appears, and the shadow holds all of this, the anger, the resentment, the hidden need for control through love, and it waits, patiently, for years sometimes, waiting for the persona to finally exhaust itself. Jung borrowed a word from the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, Enantiodromia, It describes a principle as old as the cosmos itself. When anything reaches its extreme, it transforms into its opposite. Day turns to night. Summer turns to winter. The river that swells too high eventually breaks its own banks and flows in a new direction. And the empath who has given too much, for too long, without integration of their shadow, eventually, inevitably, flips. The endless warmth becomes coolness. The constant availability becomes distance. The person who answered every call now lets the phone ring. Not because they have become cruel, not because they have stopped feeling, but because the psyche, Jung's great intelligence living beneath all our conscious choices, has reached its limit and enforced a correction. This is what Jungian psychology calls the enantiodromic moment, the night of reversal, the moment the empath goes completely silent. And this is precisely the moment that everyone around them misreads. The people who depended on the empath's warmth feel abandoned. They point to the silence as proof of something broken. They say, "Look at how they've changed. Look at how cold they've become." They experience the withdrawal as an act of aggression, but the withdrawal is not aggression. It is the psyche protecting itself. It is the shadow finally rising to the surface, not to harm anyone, but to reclaim what was lost. The empath's silence is the first honest thing they have communicated in years. It is the soul finally speaking in the only language it had left. Jung said it plainly. That which is not brought into consciousness comes to us as fate. The empath who never learned to say, "I'm exhausted," who never allowed themselves to need rest, to feel anger, to set a limit, will eventually be forced into the silence by the sheer gravity of everything they refuse to feel. The silence is not a choice in the conventional sense. It is a reckoning. The silence of the empath is not a wall. It is a doorway. On the other side of that silence, if the empath walks through it consciously rather than being dragged through it blindly, is something that Jung considered the great work of the second half of life, individuation. Individuation is not a comfortable process. It does not look like peace from the outside. It looks, in fact, very much like withdrawal, like someone pulling away from the relationships and roles and identities that defined them and going somewhere quiet and interior that other people cannot follow. But what is happening inside that silence is profound. The empath is meeting their shadow for the first time. They are sitting with their anger and not immediately converting it into forgiveness. They are feeling their resentment and not immediately dismantling it with empathy for the person who caused it. They are noticing, perhaps for the first time, the ledger they have kept without admitting to themselves they were keeping it. All those accumulated debts, all that borrowed pain, all the years of saying I'm fine, while something inside them slowly went hungry. They are discovering that they have a self that exists independently of how useful they are to other people. This is terrifying. And it is also, Jung would argue, the most important discovery a human being can make. Because the empath, who has never individuated, who has never gone silent, never turned inward, never confronted the shadow, is not actually loving anyone fully. They are loving through the persona, through the mask, through the performance of endless giving that keeps them safe from having to show up as a complete person with needs and limits and anger and grief of their own. To truly love someone, you must first be present as a whole self, and a self that has never integrated its shadow is not whole. It is performing wholeness while hiding half of its reality. So here, at last, is Jung's most misunderstood warning. He did not warn against empaths. He did not warn the people around them to prepare for abandonment. He warned the empath directly, and his warning was this: if you do not go into yourself voluntarily, the psyche will force you there. The silence is not the tragedy. The silence is the rescue. What happens before the silence, the decades of giving without receiving, of smiling through exhaustion, of converting every personal wound into an opportunity for more compassion toward the person who caused it? That is the tragedy. That is the wound that runs so deep most empaths never fully name it. Jung warned that the person who sacrifices everything for others and calls it love has made a subtle and devastating error. They have confused their persona for their soul. The persona says, "I am the one who heals. I am the one who listens. I am the one who never needs anything. I am defined entirely by my usefulness to you." The soul says, "I am a full human being, with a dark side and a bright side, with hungers and limits, with the capacity for both love and fury, for both tenderness and the hard, necessary refusal." The silence is the moment the soul wins. Not permanently, not without cost. The relationships around the empath will shift. Some will not survive. The people who were drawn to the persona, who needed the endless giver, the exhaustible saint, may not know what to do with a person who finally says, "No, not this time. I cannot give this." But the relationships that survive the silence, that can hold the empath as a whole, complex, sometimes difficult human being, those relationships become real in a way they could never be before. Because they are no longer built on performance. They are built on presence. Jung believed that psychological transformation was not linear. It does not move from wound to healing in a clean arc. It moves in spirals. You return to the same territory many times, but each time from a different height, with different eyes. The empath who has gone through the silence does not emerge as someone entirely different. They emerge as someone more complete. They still feel deeply. That never leaves. The sensitivity that made them who they are does not disappear into the shadow. It integrates. It becomes something more precise, more deliberate, less like a floodgate and more like a current that they can direct. They still love, but their love changes shape. It becomes less frantic, less compulsive, less driven by the unconscious need to make themselves indispensable. It becomes a choice, a daily, conscious, freely made choice, rather than a survival mechanism wearing the costume of generosity. They still listen, but they also, finally, speak. They speak about what they need, about what hurts them, about the limits that are not cruelty but simply the honest edges of a finite human being. And in speaking these things, in giving voice to the shadow rather than suppressing it, they break the old cycle. The cycle where giving leads to exhaustion, leads to silence, leads to guilt, leads to more giving. They step outside that cycle. And standing outside it, perhaps for the first time, they understand what Jung meant when he wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Not the self that gives perfectly and never needs anything and always understands, but the whole self, the self that includes the anger and the hunger and the long, honest silence, the self that is sometimes difficult to love, and yet is finally capable of being truly loved in return. So the next time you witness an empath go silent, or perhaps you are the empath and you are living somewhere inside this silence right now, remember what Jung was really saying. The silence is not the end of something beautiful. It is the beginning of something true. It is the psyche drawing a line between the performance and the person, between the mask and the soul, between the love that was given out of fear and the love that can only be given freely, from a place of wholeness rather than depletion. Jung spent his life studying the depths because he believed, more firmly than almost any thinker of his era, that the unconscious is not our enemy. It is our most faithful guide. It shows us, through dreams, through symptoms, through silences, through the sudden reversal of everything we thought we were. It shows us the way back to ourselves. The night the empath goes completely silent is the night the unconscious finally speaks. And if you are willing to listen to that silence, really listen, without rushing to fill it with guilt or explanation or the old familiar reaching, you will hear, underneath it, the first faint sound of something being restored. Something that should have been whole all along. This is surreal wisdom. If this reached you tonight, it found you for a reason. Subscribe and walk this path with us.